NASCAR reviewed throttle data, steering data, braking data, every single lap that both drivers ran, every radio transmission, every camera angle, and after all of that, they came out and said this: no penalty, but we are still calling both of you into the hauler this weekend. If that sentence sounds confusing to you, it should, because it confused almost everyone who heard it. The spotter sees everything, and today we are breaking down the strangest penalty decision NASCAR has made all season. Let's start with what actually happened this week. On Tuesday, NASCAR released its official penalty report for the Chicagoland incident between Shane Van Gisbergen and Austin Hill. 0 penalties, not for Van Gisbergen's contact that sent Hill into the wall. Not for Hill's retaliation hit under caution, 0. But here is the plot twist that makes this story genuinely fascinating. NASCAR did not just quietly move on. They put an official spokesperson on a podcast to explain themselves. Mike Forde, NASCAR's Vice President of Racing Communications, sat down on the Hauler Talk podcast and walked through the entire investigation. And what he revealed about how deep this review actually went should tell you something. This was not a 5-minute glance at a replay. NASCAR's competition strategist began studying throttle, steering, and braking data at the Remote Race Control Center immediately after the incident happened. Immediately, while the race was still going on, then on Monday, the day after the race, they reviewed the entire event a second time from start to finish. Every radio transmission between both teams, every camera angle available. Forde said it directly: we looked to see if there were any anomalies throughout the race. Something that spurred this. Maybe it was payback from earlier. That is NASCAR admitting on the record that they specifically investigated whether this was retaliation for something that happened weeks earlier. And here is where the story gets its first real twist, because this is not the first time these two drivers have collided. Not the second time. This is the third documented incident in less than a month. June 14th at Pocono. June 21st in San Diego. Now, Chicagoland NASCAR looked at all of it, and they still could not find what Forde called the smoking gun. Here is his exact explanation for why there is enough reasonable doubt to where it did not rise to the penalty for us here. If you remove that reasonable doubt, then you are going to get a penalty. If you say you are going to do it and then do it, that is going to rise to the level of a penalty. Now hold that quote in your mind, because it becomes very important in about 90 seconds. Because Van Gisbergen never said he was going to do it. He radioed his team immediately after the crash and called it an accident. That single radio transmission is apparently the difference between a penalty and no penalty in NASCAR's current system. Forde confirmed this directly, referencing 2 previous cases. Ryan Preece and Denny Hamlin were both penalized in past incidents specifically because they admitted intent over the radio. Van Gisbergen did the opposite. He denied it in the moment and denied it again after the race when reporters asked him directly. But here is the detail that should make you pause. Forde also revealed something about the second incident that never made it to broadcast. After the crash, as Hill's damaged car limped back toward pit road, he made contact with Van Gisbergen's door. Deliberately lied he, despite his own team begging him over the radio not to do it. And NASCAR's explanation for that one is even more surprising. Forde said officials looked at Hill's retaliation hit as, quote, emotion. He then revealed that NASCAR Senior Vice President of Competition Elton Sawyer personally weighed in on that decision. Sawyer's exact response, according to Forde, was this: no penalty there, definitely emotion. I would have done the same thing 30 years ago when I was a driver. A senior NASCAR official comparing a modern-day retaliation hit to what he personally would have done as a driver decades ago. That is not the kind of quote that usually makes it into an official explanation. But it did, because NASCAR knew exactly what question was coming next. Forde addressed it himself before anyone could even ask. He said he has noticed the social media pattern that follows these decisions. People asking if you did not think this was serious enough to penalize, why are you calling both drivers into the hauler at all? He admitted it is a fair point, and then he explained the answer in a way that reveals exactly how NASCAR is thinking about this rivalry going forward. There was nothing definitive that said this was 100% intentional, penalty worthy, you need to put a stop to this. Certainly questionable. Certainly there are hotheads with these two folks that we want to have a discussion about and make sure it does not boil over into a significant problem at Atlanta or beyond. Read that quote again. NASCAR is saying in official language that they believe there are hotheads here, that the situation could boil over, that they need to intervene before Atlanta. That is not the language of an organization that thinks nothing happened. That is the language of an organization managing a fire. They are choosing not to officially call a fire. Now here is the piece of this story that almost nobody outside the hardcore fan base knows. Why is Austin Hill even racing the number 33 car in the Cup Series at all? Austin Hill took over that car this season after Richard Childress Racing needed a driver following the death of two-time Cup Series champion Kyle Busch. Busch passed away in May from complications related to pneumonia. The first active full-time Cup Series driver to die during a season since Dale Earnhardt in 2001. Hill stepped into an emotionally loaded seat at a historically significant team in the middle of a tragedy that shook the entire garage. And it is Richard Childress himself, the Hall of Fame owner who built that team, who got on the radio at Chicagoland and called Van Gisbergen's contact blatant. Not a crew chief, not a spotter. The owner, a man in his 80s who has seen every era of this sport, personally identifying a wreck as intentional in real time on a channel he knew was being recorded. And NASCAR reviewed his own team's radio and still landed on reasonable doubt. Now let's talk about the history that makes this entire rivalry different from a normal on-track dispute. Van Gisbergen and Hill first clashed at Circuit of the Americas back in March of 2024 when both were racing full-time in what was then the Xfinity Series. Van Gisbergen said Hill drove through him entering Turn 1. Hill said Van Gisbergen ran through him entering Turn 1-5. Two completely different versions of the same moment. 2 months later at Sonoma, Hill led a restart with 11 laps remaining. Contact happened in Turn 2. Hill slid wide, Van Gisbergen went on to win the race. And during his celebratory burnout, Hill flipped him off from inside his own car. That is not a small gesture to forget. That is a driver publicly signaling in front of cameras exactly how he felt. Fast forward to this year's Cup Series season. Pocono in June, Hill pushed up the racetrack 3 wide, collecting Van Gisbergen in the process. 1 week later at San Diego, Hill's car slid down the track and clipped his own teammate Connor Zilisch, triggering a violent multi-car wreck that also collected Van Gisbergen. Zilisch's car hit the wall hard enough that the race had to be red flagged. And now Chicagoland, 4 incidents, 2 different racing series, 2 full seasons. The same 2 drivers ending up in the same wrecks over and over again. NASCAR said something important in their official statement about this pattern. They said they consider previous clashes when reviewing incidents. But in this specific case, they said the history did not factor into the final decision, which raises the exact question sitting at the center of this entire story. If 4 documented incidents across 2 seasons between the same 2 drivers is not enough context to influence a penalty decision, what actually would be? The spotter sees everything. Here is my take. NASCAR is caught between 2 competing instincts right now. On one hand, they clearly do not want to be the sanctioning body that punishes hard racing. The sport has spent years trying to loosen up, to let drivers race each other physically, to avoid the perception of overly sensitive officiating. On the other hand, they clearly recognize that this specific rivalry is different. Different enough that they are personally intervening before it reaches Atlanta. Different enough that a senior vice president of competition is having one-on-one conversations with both drivers before the meeting even happens. Different enough that Elton Sawyer already spoke with Hill on Monday, a full day before the official announcement. You do not do that level of proactive management for something you consider ordinary hard racing. The no penalty decision and the emergency meeting are not contradictory. They are actually the same message delivered 2 different ways. NASCAR is telling both drivers, we cannot prove intent this time, but we are watching. And the next incident will not get the same benefit of the doubt. The reasonable doubt that saved both drivers this week is a resource, and every rivalry has a limited supply of it. So here is my question for you. Did NASCAR make the right call by not penalizing either driver, or does 4 incidents across 2 seasons deserve more than a conversation in a hauler? Drop your take in the comments right now. If this one hit, give it a like and subscribe. The Spotter will be back this weekend from Atlanta, where Hill and Van Gisbergen sit down with NASCAR officials before they ever get back on the same racetrack.